When my dying father-in-law called me a mistake his son never fixed, I thought that was the worst thing I'd hear that day. I was wrong. What my 8-year-old son said next made the heart monitor go crazy and changed our family forever. My name is Sarah Johnson, and this is the story of how one cruel whisper in a hospital room exposed a decade of family lies. I'm married to Mike, my husband of 10 years, and we have a son named Tyler who just turned 8 last month. Mike's parents are Robert and Linda Johnson, and if you're wondering why I'm telling you their full names, it's because after what happened in that hospital room, I'm done protecting people who never protected me. Robert Johnson spent 10 years making sure I knew I didn't belong in his family. He's 68 years old, a retired factory supervisor who believes respect is something you inherit, not something you earn. Every family dinner, every holiday, every birthday party for Tyler, Robert found ways to remind me that I wasn't good enough for his son. Sometimes it was subtle, like deliberately mispronouncing my maiden name or asking Mike if he was sure about his choices right in front of me. Other times it was direct, like when he told me at Tyler's 6th birthday that he hoped his grandson wouldn't pick up any of my bad habits. Linda Johnson, Mike's mother, is 65 and spent 30 years as a nurse before retiring. You'd think someone in the medical field would understand compassion, but Linda perfected something much worse than cruelty. She perfected enablement. Every time Robert said something that made my stomach drop, Linda would smile. Not a nervous smile or an apologetic smile, but a knowing smile that said she agreed with every word her husband spoke. Mike tried to defend me over the years, but Robert had a way of making those conversations happen when Mike wasn't around. At family gatherings, Mike would be helping in the kitchen or playing with Tyler, and Robert would lean over and make his comments. By the time Mike returned, the moment had passed, and bringing it up later just seemed petty. But Tyler saw everything. My son has these bright, observant eyes that miss nothing. He watched his grandfather treat me like an outsider. He watched his grandmother smile when it happened, and apparently, he talked to his father about it more than I ever knew. 3 weeks ago, Robert collapsed at home and was rushed to St. Mary's Hospital. The doctors told us his kidneys were shutting down and his heart was weak. They gave him days, maybe a week. Mike took time off work to be at the hospital, and of course, I went with him. Not because Robert wanted me there, but because Mike needed support, and Tyler needed to say goodbye to his grandfather. That's how I found myself standing in room 314, watching machines keep my father-in-law alive while he used his final breaths to tell me I was never supposed to be part of his family. What I didn't expect was that my 8-year-old son had been prepared for this exact moment, armed with information that would turn Robert's cruelty into desperate panic. The heart monitor that started beeping wasn't signaling medical distress. It was signaling the moment a dying man realized his prejudice might have cost him his life. The first thing that hits you when you walk into a hospital room where someone is dying is the smell. It's not just antiseptic and medicine. It's something deeper, something that makes your chest tight because your body knows what's coming, even when your mind isn't ready. Room 314 at St. Mary's Hospital had that smell, mixed with the sound of machines that were doing most of the work Robert's body couldn't do anymore. I'd been in this room every day for 3 weeks, watching my husband struggle with emotions he couldn't name. Mike loved his father, but he also knew who his father was. Robert Johnson wasn't an easy man to love, and death doesn't magically make difficult people kind. If anything, it seemed to make Robert more determined to say the things he'd been holding back. The room itself was standard hospital depressing. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick, and a window that faced the parking garage. Robert's bed was positioned so he could see everyone who entered, which felt intentional. Even dying, he wanted control over his space. The machines surrounded him like loyal soldiers, a heart monitor with its steady beeping, an oxygen concentrator humming constantly, and an IV pole with bags of fluid that were keeping him hydrated because he'd stopped eating 2 days ago. Linda had claimed the chair closest to Robert's bed, which surprised no one. In 37 years of marriage, she'd never been more than 3 feet away from her husband when he needed her. She wore the same navy blue cardigan she'd worn every day since Robert was admitted, and her gray hair was pulled back in the same tight bun she'd maintained since I'd known her. Linda was the kind of woman who found comfort in routine, even when that routine was watching her husband die. Tyler had adapted to the hospital environment the way children do, with an acceptance that both amazed and broke my heart. He'd brought his coloring books and a small container of crayons, and he'd set up what he called his art station in the corner chair by the window. The nursing staff loved him because he was quiet and polite, always saying please and thank you when they checked on Robert. But I could see the strain in my son's face. 8-year-olds shouldn't have to learn about death in real time, watching machines do the work of keeping someone alive. Mike had been incredible through all of this, but the stress was wearing on him. He'd lost 15 pounds because he wasn't eating regularly. He'd developed a habit of running his hands through his hair when he was anxious, which meant his hair stuck up at odd angles most of the time. His job had been understanding about the time off, but I knew he was worried about falling behind. Mike was the kind of person who handled stress by trying to control everything he possibly could, which meant he'd appointed himself the family coordinator for all things Robert. That afternoon, Mike had gone downstairs to handle insurance paperwork and speak with the social worker about hospice arrangements. We'd been putting off that conversation, but the doctors had made it clear that Robert wouldn't be coming home. The paperwork was extensive, and Mike wanted to handle it himself rather than burden me with the details. He'd been gone about 30 minutes when Robert decided it was time for our conversation. I'd been standing by the window watching Tyler color a picture of what looked like our house. He was using brown for the roof and yellow for the walls, the same colors as our actual house, and he'd added a tree in the front yard that was much bigger than our real tree. Children's drawings always made everything look happier than reality. The atmosphere in the room had been tense but quiet. Linda was reading a romance novel, something with a shirtless man on the cover that seemed inappropriate for a hospital room, but somehow fit Linda perfectly. She'd always escaped into books when real life became too much to handle. Robert had been dozing on and off, his breathing shallow but steady. I should have known something was coming when Robert's eyes opened and stayed open. He had this way of looking at people when he was preparing to say something significant. It wasn't a kind look or even a neutral look. It was the look of someone who'd made a decision and was committed to following through, regardless of consequences. The machines continued their steady rhythm, completely unaware that the family they were monitoring was about to fall apart. Tyler kept coloring, focused on adding details to his tree. Linda turned a page in her book, still smiling at whatever romantic scene she was reading. And Robert cleared his throat, which was my signal that our decade-long Cold War was about to become something much more direct and much more final. Robert's voice was weaker than it had been even yesterday, but when he motioned for me to come closer to his bed, there was nothing weak about his intention. I hesitated for a moment, glancing at Tyler, who was still absorbed in his coloring, then at Linda, who had looked up from her romance novel with curious eyes. Something in Robert's expression told me this wasn't going to be a request for water or a question about Mike's whereabouts. I walked the few steps to his bedside, close enough that he wouldn't have to strain his voice, but far enough away that I could step back quickly if needed. Robert had never been physically threatening, but there was something about a dying man that made every interaction feel unpredictable. His eyes were clearer than they'd been in days, as if he'd been saving his energy for this specific moment. "Sarah," he said, and even my name sounded like an accusation coming from his lips. "Come closer. There's something I need to say to you before I die." The way he said "before I die" made my skin crawl, not because he was acknowledging his mortality, but because he was using it as justification for whatever cruelty was about to come. I took one small step closer, my hands instinctively clasping together in front of me, a defensive gesture I'd developed over years of Robert's verbal attacks. "You know what I regret most about dying?" Robert's voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was deliberate and clear. "That I never convinced Mike to fix his mistake. You were never meant to be part of this family, Sarah. You're not my real daughter-in-law. You're just an accident he never corrected." The words hit me like a physical blow. 10 years of smaller insults had been building to this moment, this final verdict from a man who was using his deathbed as a platform for one last act of cruelty. But it wasn't just the words themselves that made my hands start shaking. It was the satisfaction in his voice, the way he'd clearly been planning this speech, waiting for the right moment when Mike wasn't there to defend me. What made it worse was Linda's reaction. I turned to look at her, expecting shock or at least discomfort at her husband's viciousness. Instead, Linda smiled. Not the nervous smile of someone caught off guard, but the same knowing, approving smile she'd been giving me for 10 years whenever Robert made his comments. This smile said she'd been waiting for this moment too, that she agreed with every word her husband had just spoken. "Robert," I managed to say, my voice barely steady, "this isn't the time or place for this." "This is exactly the time," Robert replied, his voice gaining strength from somewhere deep inside his failing body. "I'm dying, Sarah, and I won't die pretending you belong here. Mike was young and confused when he married you. He thought he loved you, but love isn't enough when you don't fit. You never fit, and you never will." Linda set down her book and folded her hands in her lap, watching this exchange like it was entertainment. "Robert's right, dear," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Some things need to be said. Mike deserves better than settling for his first mistake." The word mistake, coming from Linda, felt like a betrayal on a completely different level. Robert had always been openly hostile, but Linda had maintained a facade of politeness for 10 years. Her mask was finally off, and underneath was someone who had been judging me just as harshly as her husband, just more quietly. I felt my face burning with anger and humiliation. Tyler was still in the room, still coloring, but I could see his crayon had stopped moving. He was listening to every word, watching his grandparents tell his mother she didn't belong in the family. This was the legacy they wanted to leave him? This was how they wanted to spend their final days? "You've made your point," I said, stepping back from Robert's bed. "Both of you have made your point very clear." But Robert wasn't finished. The boy deserves to know the truth about his family. He deserves to know that real families don't happen by accident. They happen because people choose wisely. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about hurting me. Robert was planning to poison Tyler's perception of our family, to plant seeds of doubt about whether Mike had made the right choice in marrying me. He wanted Tyler to grow up questioning whether his parents' marriage was legitimate, whether his mother was worthy of the Johnson name. My hands stopped shaking and clenched into fists. I was done being Robert's target, and I was absolutely done with him using Tyler as ammunition in his war against me. But before I could respond, before I could defend myself or protect my son, Tyler stood up from his chair. His small voice cut through the tension in the room like a blade. "Grandpa, Dad told me what to say if you ever said something mean about Mom again." The moment Tyler spoke, everything in room 314 changed. The air itself seemed to shift, becoming thick with anticipation and something else I couldn't quite identify. My 8-year-old son was standing beside his little chair, his Spider-Man coloring book still open in his hands, but his posture was different. He wasn't the quiet, well-behaved child who had been sitting in the corner for the past 3 weeks. He was someone I'd never seen before, someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. I felt my heart stop. Tyler had heard everything, every cruel word Robert had whispered, every enabling smile from Linda, every moment of this verbal assassination that was supposed to be Robert's final gift to me. But instead of looking hurt or confused, Tyler looked prepared. There was something in his eyes that reminded me of Mike when he'd made up his mind about something important. "Tyler, honey, maybe you should go find your dad," I said quickly, my voice barely controlled. The last thing I wanted was for my son to get caught in the middle of Robert's deathbed cruelty. Children shouldn't have to witness their grandfather's final act of hatred, and they definitely shouldn't feel like they need to defend their mother from a dying man. But Tyler shook his head, his grip tightening on his coloring book. "No, Mom. Dad said this might happen. He told me exactly what to say." Robert's eyes narrowed as he looked at his grandson. Even weakened by kidney failure and heart problems, Robert still had the ability to make people feel small with just a look. "Boy, this is grown-up business. You don't understand what's happening here." "I understand that you're being mean to my mom," Tyler replied, his voice steady in a way that made my chest tight with pride and terror. "I understand that you think she doesn't belong in our family. Dad said you might say that someday." Linda leaned forward in her chair, her romance novel forgotten. "Tyler, sweetheart, your grandfather is just trying to help you understand some complicated things about families." "Dad already explained it to me," Tyler said, looking directly at Linda with an expression that was far too mature for an 8-year-old. He said sometimes grown-ups think they know better than other grown-ups about who should love who. He said Grandpa might try to make me think bad things about Mom, but that I should remember something important if that happened. I was frozen in place, watching this conversation unfold with a mixture of amazement and horror. Mike had prepared Tyler for this possibility. My husband had actually anticipated that his dying father might use his final days to poison our son against me. The thought that Mike had seen this coming and had armed Tyler with a response made me realize how much my husband had been protecting me from, how much he'd been managing behind the scenes. Robert struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, his face flushed with anger despite his weakness. "What exactly did your father tell you to remember, boy?" Tyler walked closer to Robert's bed, his small feet making no sound on the hospital floor. He still held his coloring book, but now it looked less like a child's toy and more like a shield. "Dad said if you ever called Mom a mistake or said she didn't belong in our family, I should tell you something that might change your mind." "Nothing is going to change my mind about your mother," Robert said, his voice gaining strength from his anger. "I've had 10 years to form my opinion, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because I'm dying." "Dad said you might say that too," Tyler replied calmly. "He said you're really stubborn and that you don't like to admit when you're wrong about important things." Linda stood up from her chair, her face showing the first signs of genuine concern I'd seen from her in 3 weeks. "Tyler, maybe you should wait until your father gets back before you say anything else." But Tyler was already committed to whatever path Mike had prepared him for. "Mom, did you know that Dad talks to me about grown-up stuff sometimes? He tells me things that he thinks I'm old enough to understand, even if other people think I'm too little." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Mike had always treated Tyler like a capable, intelligent person rather than just a child. It was one of the things I loved most about my husband, the way he respected our son's ability to handle difficult concepts when they were explained properly. "Well, Dad told me that sometimes families have secrets that protect people, and sometimes those secrets have to come out when people are being unfair." Tyler looked directly at Robert, his young face serious and determined. "Dad said Mom has been protecting a secret that could help save your life, but you've been too mean to her for too long, and she might not want to help you anymore." The heart monitor started beeping faster. The heart monitor wasn't beeping from medical distress. Robert's vitals were actually stabilizing as adrenaline flooded his system, his body responding to shock in a way that made every machine in the room register the change. His face had gone from flushed anger to pale confusion in the span of seconds, and his eyes were locked on Tyler with an intensity that would have been frightening if my son hadn't been so clearly in control of the moment. "What secret?" Robert's voice was stronger than it had been all day, powered by a desperation I'd never heard from him before. "What are you talking about, boy?" Tyler set his coloring book down on the small rolling table beside Robert's bed, the same table that held water cups and medication schedules. The gesture was deliberate and mature, like he was putting away childish things to handle adult business. "Dad said Mom's family has special knowledge about sickness that runs in families. He said Mom knew things about your sickness before the doctors figured it out, but she never told you because you were always mean to her." I felt the blood drain from my face. Mike had told Tyler about my uncle, about the genetic counseling, about the real reason we'd gotten married so quickly after dating for only 8 months. This wasn't just family medical history that Tyler was about to reveal. This was the secret that had shaped our entire marriage, the information that had made Mike realize his family's pattern of heart disease and kidney problems wasn't just bad luck. "Tyler," I started, but my son held up his small hand the same way I'd seen Mike do when he needed to finish an important thought. "Mom's uncle is Dr. Williams at the Regional Cancer Center," Tyler continued, his voice clear and confident. "He's not just any doctor. He's a genetic counselor, and when Mom brought Dad to meet him before they got married, Uncle Williams told them about something called hereditary kidney disease and heart problems that run in families like ours." Linda's face went white. She sank back into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests. That's impossible. We would have known if Robert had something genetic. Mom knew, Tyler said, looking at Linda with the same direct gaze he'd been giving Robert. She knew because Uncle Williams tested Dad's blood and found the markers. Mom married Dad knowing he might get sick like Grandpa, and she's been watching for signs for 10 years. Robert's breathing became rapid and shallow, but not from his failing organs. This was panic breathing, the kind that happens when your entire understanding of reality shifts in an instant. You're lying. Children make up stories. Tyler walked to where I was standing, reached into my purse that was sitting on the windowsill, and pulled out a small notebook I always carried. I watched in amazement as my son flipped through pages of what looked like random notes, but were actually my careful tracking of Robert's symptoms over the years, cross-referenced with the genetic markers my uncle had identified in Mike's blood work. Mom writes down everything, Tyler said, holding up the notebook. Every time Grandpa got sick, every time he went to the doctor, every time the doctors couldn't figure out why his kidneys were getting worse. She's been keeping track because Uncle Williams told her to watch the whole family for signs. The heart monitor's beeping intensified, but Robert was staring at the notebook in Tyler's hands like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Give me that," he whispered. "Dad said I should only show this to Grandpa if he ever called Mom a mistake," Tyler replied. "He said Mom has been trying to help this family for 10 years, but nobody ever asked her for help because they didn't think she was smart enough or important enough to have answers." I took the notebook from Tyler's hands, my own hands shaking as I opened it to the section where I documented Robert's medical history, alongside the genetic markers my uncle had identified. The pages were filled with dates, symptoms, doctor visits, and my own observations about patterns the medical team treating Robert had missed. "This is why we got married so fast," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not because we were young and reckless, but because Mike wanted to make sure I'd be legally able to share medical information if something happened to him or his family. My uncle identified a genetic mutation that causes progressive kidney disease and cardiomyopathy. It explains everything that's been happening to you, Robert." Robert's eyes moved from the notebook to my face, and for the first time in 10 years, he was looking at me like I was a person instead of an obstacle. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because every time I tried to talk to you about anything medical, you told me to mind my own business," I replied. "Because you made it clear that my opinions and my family's expertise weren't welcome in your life." The machines around Robert's bed continued their mechanical symphony, but the man himself had gone completely still. The silence in room 314 stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Robert stared at the notebook in my hands, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen from him before. Confusion, regret, and something that might have been fear. The heart monitor had settled into a steadier rhythm, but faster than his normal resting rate, as if his body was processing the shock of 10 years of wasted time. "Tyler, go find your dad," I said quietly, keeping my eyes on Robert. "Tell him Grandpa wants to talk to him about family medical history." My son nodded and headed for the door, but he paused in the doorway and looked back at his grandfather. "Grandpa, Mom never stopped trying to help you, even when you were mean to her. Dad says that's what real family does." After Tyler left, the room felt different, smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer together. Linda was clutching her romance novel against her chest like a shield, her eyes darting between Robert and me as if she was seeing both of us clearly for the first time. "Sarah." Robert's voice was hoarse, stripped of all the authority and cruelty it had carried just minutes before. "I need to see what's in that book." I walked closer to his bed and opened the notebook to the first page of medical observations. "This starts from our second year of marriage, when you had that kidney stone episode that the emergency room couldn't fully explain. My uncle said to watch for recurring kidney issues, unexplained fatigue, and irregular heartbeat patterns." Robert's eyes scanned the pages as I flipped through them, date after date of his symptoms, carefully documented and cross-referenced with genetic markers that predicted exactly the kind of organ failure he was experiencing now. "You've been watching me for 8 years?" 10 years, I corrected. I started documenting everything the day after Mike and I got the genetic test results back. My uncle said early intervention could add decades to your life if we caught the progression in time. Linda finally spoke, her voice small and shaky. Robert, all those times Sarah asked about your doctor appointments, all those times she suggested you get second opinions on your test results. She was trying to help, Robert finished, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. She was trying to save my life, and I thought she was being nosy. I closed the notebook and set it on his bedside table. The genetic mutation is called ADPKD with associated cardiomyopathy. It's autosomal dominant, which means Mike has a 50% chance of having it, and Tyler has a 25% chance. We've been monitoring both of them since Tyler was born. Robert closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with tears. How much time did I waste? How much time could I have had if I'd listened to you? I don't know, I answered honestly. Maybe years, maybe decades. The treatments work best when you start them early before the kidney damage becomes severe. Why didn't you just tell me anyway? Robert asked. Why didn't you force me to listen? I pulled the visitor chair closer to his bed and sat down for the first time in 3 weeks of hospital visits. Because you made it clear that nothing I said mattered to you. Because every time I tried to be part of this family, you reminded me I didn't belong. Because I got tired of fighting for respect from someone who was determined not to give it. When Mike returned with Tyler, he found his father asking detailed questions about genetic testing and treatment options. Robert wanted to know everything. How long had we known? What treatments were available? Could Tyler be tested safely at his age? Was there anything that could still be done for Robert himself? Mike answered every question patiently, pulling up medical websites on his phone and explaining the genetic counseling process that had guided our family planning for the past decade. For the first time in my memory, Mike's parents hung on every word he said, treating him like the intelligent, capable man he'd always been, instead of the child they still thought they were raising. Linda approached me as Mike and Robert discussed treatment timelines. Sarah, I owe you an apology that I can't possibly make adequately. You owe me 10 years, I replied, but apologies are a start. Robert lived for 6 more days after our conversation. He spent those days asking questions, reading medical articles Mike printed for him, and talking to Tyler about the importance of family medical knowledge. On his last day, he asked to speak to me privately. I was wrong about you, he said simply. You weren't the mistake. I was. Sometimes the people we desperately want to accept us aren't worthy of the effort. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, they figure that out before it's too late. Robert died knowing that the daughter-in-law he'd rejected had been trying to save his life for 10 years. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below about your own experiences with difficult family relationships and subscribe to our channel for more real stories about love, loss, and the complicated truth about family.